Today we're going to talk about creating a sense of depth or space in your painting, particularly using photographs. And there's two different lighting conditions when we're photographing. One gives you some space. You can notice more depth in your photograph when you get back home, put it on the computer or develop it or whatever you're doing. The other, the type of lighting, gives you no depth at all. And this particular photograph is that type. It's when the sun is behind the viewer. So as I'm taking this picture, the sun is on my back. It's behind me. And what that typically does is you can see and hear the darks way in the distance. While they're lighter than the darks in the foreground, they're still way too dark. And here's the darkest dark in the photograph, and it's more in the midground. But all these dark accents are all the same, even if they're back in here or back in here, they're just real dark. Even this is way too dark. Also, the lights are also too dark. Not enough brightness to them. And by brightness, I don't mean stronger color. We're not talking about color right now. We're just talking about value, and they're just a bit too dark. The other type, and this is where I'm looking into the sun a little bit. The sun is actually way up in here out of view, but it's in front of me instead of being behind, and you can see it creates a lot more depth. Distant mountains are a lot lighter than the foreground trees, and it's that value difference there that really creates that room in there, that sense of space that you don't get with the other photograph. So be aware, not that I don't want to paint with the sun at my back, I just have to be aware that if I'm standing outside, and especially with photographs, the darks are going to be almost as dark in the background as they are in the foreground. But you can really see they separate here. There's a value here, and then here. There's three different darks, and that really creates that sense of space. Plus, the darks, and we're strictly talking darks now, are still bluer, are cooler back here than they are up front. You know, these darks are cool, the ones up front, but they're not as cool as the ones in back. So you want that value difference, really big jump in value between foreground shadow and background shadow, but also a temperature difference within the cool shadow. This is cool, but still slightly warmer than this. So if I'm looking at this, considering the colors in my palette, this is blue with a lot more yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is there to make it slightly warmer. It's still going to be a blue-green, still going to be cool, but not as cool back in here. And back here, I'll use more white and more blue and just a little bit of orange. Not to turn it green, but to make it just a muted blue. So I got muted blue that's lighter and a darker, slightly warmer bluish green. And then some variations in between to get the depth in there. This is another one. You can see the sun. It's right about in here. Still, it's out of view, but it's right about there. You can see the shadows show that too. But a lot of depth when we're looking at the distance back in here and then the darks here. There's also a lot of depth and distance between these darks and then this dark and then that dark and that dark. There's a subtle value change that really goes back, and the camera picks it up, and our eye picks it up more when we're kind of looking somewhat into the sun. I mean, the sun does not have to be, right there. It can be way over to the side or way over to this side, but as long as it's kind of in front of us instead of behind us, the camera will pick up more depth, and I think our eye sees it better too, as opposed to the sunlight being behind our back. It kind of flattens things and makes our darks just as dark, again, like this photograph. So as I'm looking at this, I made a few changes here. Background first, you can see I lightened up the shadow on the mountains. Lightened up the shadow on these evergreens right here. And then I also slightly lightened the aspens back in there. Then the next step is this middle ground value range. Lightened up the shadow on these pine trees. And I also lightened up the lights on the pine trees. Same thing on the hillside. A little bit lighter shadow than these shadows even, but lighter, and then lighten up the lights a bit more. I mean, I still want a strong kind of muted green on those evergreen trees, but these are just too dark. If I'm going to lighten the shadow, I have to lighten the light area too, so I still have that contrast. I still want a lot of contrast. I just want to lighten the darks and lighten the lights. Next step here is a little more of the closer middle ground, lightening up these yellow aspens, lightening up the shadow on the yellow aspens a little bit, and some of the shrubbery, that kind of muted orange. You just have to have a change of value. Lights are way too dark and darks get too dark. And then lastly, well, also in the foreground, you can see I'm lightening up this green here, cutting down on some of those rocks. The rocks tend to, they are man-made. They're piled up there. I can kind of cut into it with the grass just to keep that line of rocks from looking too man-made. I didn't lighten up the grass, I actually darkened the grass. Really nothing wrong with this grass. I just made it a bit more green just to contrast that yellow a bit more. And lastly, I think the water's a hair too dark also. So using some real pale blue scrubbed into this warmer color right here, you can see, which is probably blue, burnt sienna with a little bit of crimson. And if while it's wet, scrub some real light blue into it, wipe most of it off the brush. Just keeps it from getting too dark. We generally have the opposite problem. There's not enough darks. We don't push them enough. But if we copy these darks in here, in this photograph, they're going to be way too dark. So are the lights. But if we just think value, now my colors are all slightly muted. I don't have any bright colors in here. And bright color doesn't mean lighter value. Sometimes we think if we make our colors brighter, that means they're lighter, but not necessarily. As you can see here, I can have a fairly muted light yellow, and it still looks pretty bright. It has to do with getting the darks around it dark enough. But in this case, the darks are too dark, so I'm getting them a little bit lighter. I'm also simplifying these shapes. You can see these darks create a pattern a lot more in my computerized painting than in the photograph. Here the pattern is more just dots and dashes. It doesn't get into solid shape till we get to this tree back in here. So really simplify. Create bigger masses that kind of stand on their own without breaking them up too much. Now this is a backlit one, and the contrast isn't too bad. But I still want more contrast between this dark and this dark. It's not quite enough. Also up here in front, lights and the shadows are a bit too close together. First thing I want to do is lighten that shadow in the background and simplify. Get rid of some of those little dots and dashes of light. And a simple suggestion of where the light's hitting. I really simplified it even more. Again, you can see I got 2 layers of mountains and a muted warm of where the sun hits it on top. And it has to be muted because it's way in the distance. And then in the foreground, getting the darks just a bit darker and popping some of those lights a bit stronger. A little lighter, but also not quite as much of a complement to gray. I want to pop that color in front, and that's going to come forward more. And the muted colors will stay in the background. Now, in this last one, the sun is coming from behind. It's hitting my back. So again, the lights in the background trees are pretty dark. They don't go back at all. Same thing with the yellow field. There's not much variation. There is a little bit. And same thing with these yellow aspens. So when you're photographing and the sun is directly behind you, you're going to get more of a flatness. So you have to know how to approach that. So I tend to like to have the sun coming from the side, slightly in front, or in front. That doesn't mean I don't photograph with the sun behind me. I just have to be aware that I have to lighten up some things. So starting in the background, see, I used a muted blue-green, blue with a little bit of ochre. It is warm. I have to have it look sunlit. Now, it's a lot cooler than that. This has a lot of yellow in it. So I cut down on the yellow, add a bit of yellow ochre to the ultramarine blue, and I did add some darker muted blue for some shadow. There's too much distance to show any other color within the shadow except for just a muted blue. The shadows in the background really simplified to just pretty much a muted blue. Might get a little lighter as it goes further back or slightly darker as it comes forward. But you can see how that separates from these greens right here. A lot more yellow-orange in these greens. None in these greens. A little bit more ochre maybe, but not much. So that shoves that back. Same thing here. Now I'm creating a couple of different values of the dark yellow-orange. And again, orange, probably with a little bit of crimson, alizarin crimson and a touch of blue. I don't have any yellow in the shadow. It's too dark and cool. But that gives me a difference in value on those trees. So I'm creating a bigger, simpler shape to make them read better. And a little darker orange, crimson, and blue here in front. Now there's white in both of those shadow colors of the yellow-orange, because even the shadow's fairly light because the color of those yellow-orange leaves are real light. And then a few highlights on the lights. But I want a variation, my stronger, in the foreground here, a stronger yellow-orange. In other words, I don't mute it, and a bit less white in front. Then gradually get it a little more muted. And then in the background, I add a little bit of light violet on the very end. And I just scrub that in to the color, and it pushes that back. I don't necessarily see violet in the background when I look at the photograph, and you can see here, there's no violet on the flat plane way in the distance, but by adding a little bit in the painting, it makes that flat plane recede back a lot more. A little bit lighter in the background and cooler, some more simpler value change in the aspens, in the shadows, and then same thing with the flat ground. 2 or 3 value changes, and then really cool, scrubbing in some violet in the background. And that just gives it more depth. Got some images here, some paintings. I'll talk about how they're pushing the idea of creating space. This is a painting by Edward Compton. He's not very well known, but really an excellent painter. And he painted in watercolor and oils and pastels, everything. He did everything really well. Now these shadows back here look really dark. But when you compare it to this dark, you know, there's a big difference. These are a lot darker. Same thing with the shadows back in here. Shadows are a lot lighter, a lot less contrast in the background. But as you come forward, these darks really get dark, and you can really see the difference. Also, values in the lights. These lights are really light. A lot of contrast in this painting. And the sun's coming from the side instead of the back or the front. So pretty good depth in there. But I imagine he pushed this quite a bit. And he also pushed these shadows quite a bit lighter too than the shadows in front. But a lot of contrast and value. And if that looks close in value, we can, there's those background shadows look close to the foreground shadows. If we make it a black and white, you can see it better. You can see how much lighter these darks are than these darks. This is by Alexander Jacob. He was a French painter, early 20th century. Not well known either, but you can see the darkest darks are here in front, and they're not very dark because you're looking into the sun. Sun is probably over here behind the trees, or maybe right in there. But you can see the darks gradually getting darker. And there's enough haze of sunlight that we're looking into that the darkest darks here are not very dark. He does save his darkest dark for the figure in the boat there. It does make the figure come really forward and the boat come forward, but he's sacrificing that, the depth in the figure, to make it the focal point. Nothing wrong with breaking the rules as long as you know what you're doing. But that really stands out because he's got the darkest dark there. And this next painting is also by Compton. You can see the darkest darks in front. And gradually things are getting a little bit lighter yet, until these darks back in here are the lightest. And keeping the lights light enough also to go with the darks. In other words, you can't have a black shadow and a real light. If the shadow is really dark, then the light has to be a little bit darker light, because the overall color of like this pine tree is dark overall. Even in lights, it's fairly dark compared to the ground or the snow or the clouds.